soul family, and welcome to the Walk On Podcast, the podcast where I try to demystify spirituality, personal growth and healing, and whatever else I feel like talking about. I'm your host, Britt Cannon, and this week's episode is called Darvo. It's about this manipulation technique where it stands for deny, attack, and reverse victim and offender. It's this I don't know, anyone who's been in a toxic relationship knows this, but it seems like all abusers kind of act from the same playbook. Like there is a foolproof technique that exists in the world, and all toxic people kind of do the same things. And enough people have witnessed this and studied it and analyzed it where they figured out how to spell it out to people who don't operate this way so that they can spot it when it happens and maybe save themselves a little time, effort, energy, struggle, confusion, because once you see it for what it is, it makes it really hard for you to fall for it again, which is why taking time and space after one of these relationships is so crucial, or several in some of our cases, why it's so crucial to take the time and space to heal, because you need to make sense of it. Otherwise, you're going to find yourself repeating these same patterns in different relationships. So this tactic or technique usually comes about when someone is asking a toxic person to take accountability for their behavior. So being confronted with harm they did. It's kind of, I've seen people refer to this as whataboutism, where you bring something to someone and you're like, hey, this thing you did really hurt me and I'd like to talk about it. And then the person, instead of being like, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry, I totally see where you're coming from. I'm gonna make sure never to do that again. And thank you so much for telling me, which is a normal, healthy, loving response to boundaries. Now, let me just clarify that to receive and respect someone else's boundary, it doesn't have to be a thing that you feel 100% super great about. Nobody likes feeling like they fucked up. Nobody likes hearing that they hurt someone they love's feelings. It doesn't always feel great to receive someone's boundary. And if someone tries to lay a boundary with you and you don't always feel great about it, if it makes you sad, if it sends you into a shame spiral, it's okay to have feelings. It's okay for this to be really complicated. And it's okay to take a second. It's okay to not jump right to thank you so much for telling me I hurt your feelings. It might take the span of a full conversation or even several conversations to get to a place where you can feel really great about it. But what is super duper important is to not what about the person who's brave enough to bring a boundary to you, right? So what we're not going to do is be like, well, you da 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 da. Well, what about when you blah 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 blah, right? Because that's just being a deflector. You're just saying, I'm not taking any of this in. I don't respect your feelings. I'm not acknowledging how courageous it is to bring up something like this. I'm not acknowledging that this is actually a really loving thing to do and shows me that you want this relationship to continue on. That's what a boundary is. A boundary is a loving gesture. I feel like when someone really, really hurts you and has shown that they don't give a fuck about your feelings or give a fuck about your well-being or give a fuck about your boundaries, it's personally or perfectly and personally reasonable to just block, delete, unfriend, unfollow. I actually have an episode about this called Block, Delete, Unfriend, Unfollow, where it's your prerogative, baby. It's your life. You have control over who comes in and who gets kicked out of it. And really, you can do that whenever you want at any time. I think for people who had traumatic childhoods, I talked about this a little bit last time. Like when you're stuck in an unsafe place where you're being mistreated, like you literally don't have a choice. You were born into these circumstances, you are stuck in them until you can get out, usually in adulthood, right? You get used to feeling stuck. Like, I think if you know about complex PTSD, there is this like, it's not like regular PTSD, that's why it's complex, where you get like flashbacks. It's like very clearly like I was affected by this one experience, and I I can pinpoint exactly this moment because it was like something very tangible that happened to me that traumatized me. A lot of people who have complex PTSD also have regular PTSD. But it's a lot more like nebulous. And I like to think of mine as sort of like a cloud that comes over me, or that I moved through life surrounded by, where like it hazed my ability to see situations clearly on like many different levels. So I might like I might feel stuck for the rest of my life, but I'm like disempowered. I'm unaware that I have a say in, as an adult, in what I stick around in. Maybe I'm like financially dependent on a toxic partner, so it's really hard for me to like get the resources I need to get away. Like maybe I'm stuck in a job that sucks, that abuses me, that I'm not happy with because like I really need the money. You know, there's maybe I can't cut my family off because I'm really close to the kids in my family. You know, there's like all these reasons why you're stuck, for sure. Like nobody's arguing with that stuck actually happens in life. But a lot of times, like, you have this melange of stuck because you only know stuck. You don't know how to break free from something. You don't know that you have power in your own life. You have a say in where you go, what you spend your time and energy on. And so you go around feeling stuck because you have this haze of stuck from your childhood that's like tainting and coloring every situation you go into. That's why like self-empowerment, self-love, self-actualization, and like this idea that you are the creator of your own reality is super liberating, and like has been really crucial on my journey because I was extremely disempowered. And because this Darvo thing happened to me from like early childhood, I was also kind of always confused about like what a good person was and what a bad person was, and like how my own individuation, if you don't know, is like when you start to become like an individual away from your parents. A lot of toxic families have this thing called enmeshment going on, which is where there's not a lot of boundaries, where your parent, one of your, like, you might have an overtly abusive parent and then a covertly abusive parent. So you have one where you're like, I know that's bad. This one, by comparison, seems like angelic, you know, perfection, my hero, whatever. But they might, because they have an abusive partner and an unavailable partner, they might put a lot of that energy into you as a child. So like this happened with me, where I was my most safe caregiver's like best friend, therapist, companion, like little husband. I just served all these roles for her, and she really leaned on me in a way that was helpful as far as like feeling safe and feeling like I was receiving love, but it was really hindering in the sense that I was never allowed to have a life. I was never allowed to like even have close friends or prioritize my partners. I did it anyway a lot of times, but not without putting up with tremendous amounts of like guilt and shame and discouragement and constant criticism, and her always trying to drive a wedge between me and like anyone else in my life, like anyone else. And it's, it's a really twisted way to interact with like children who don't have freedom or like are learning identity, or like they're just they're just naturally supposed to like grow apart from you. I heard someone, I can't remember who, but like a spiritual teacher or like a healer or something, say that parenthood is one of the like toughest relationships you'll ever be in, because it's the only one where the goal is separation. Where like if you do a good job, your kids walk away from you. They grow away from you. Not like forever, like cut you off, but that relationship you have in the beginning where they're totally dependent on you and they like love you unconditionally because there's this primal need there. Like that never exists in that same capacity again. And I think a lot of people don't think like that. Like they don't think that one day this relationship is good, or the whole way through this relationship is going to change and evolve, and like, and this person's going to evolve and I'm not going to have such a tight grip on them. The irony is, and this is with all relationships, this is why every episode I quote this Dr. Maya Angelou quote, which is love liberates, it doesn't bind. Because the great irony is the tighter you cling on someone, the more they're going to want to squirm. And the more effortlessly and like freely you love them, the more likely they are to stay. And a lot of this behavior comes out of the fear of being alone, which I think is like, if you could sum up codependence in like one phrase, that's what it is, right? It's like the fear of being alone. So you do anything within your power to avoid that discomfort of like that experience. And, I think it's so interesting the way that like abusive people and like people pleasers or codependent people are kind of two sides of the same coin. I think that's why there tends to be this draw between unhealed people on both sides of the spectrum, and why sometimes it can be so murky when you're trying to figure out like which one you were in a dynamic, because a lot of the core wounds are exactly the same. So all the behavior is coming from the same place. And a lot of the coping mechanisms can look very similar. Obviously, there's usually a person with more power who's doing more damage, but especially as the relationship goes on and you start to throw in things like reactive abuse, it can get very hazy and nuanced, and like for the untrained eye, it's sometimes hard to figure out. And people tend to think like, well, the calmer person is probably the one who did less harm, or like, I don't know, they look for like a perfect victim, and a lot of times the actual victim in the scenario is so emotionally dysregulated that they aren't as appealing to like buy into as the victim. But that's exactly the sign that exists to show you like who's really pulling the strings here, who's really causing the harm. Why with the honking? So it all gets very confusing, and especially because this tactic exists. And this Darvo tactic, like as with everything being everything, I have an episode called Everything is Everything if you want to hear more about this, but it's like what we do in our personal lives, it plays out politically, it plays out in our family dynamics, it plays out spiritually. Like truly the way you do one thing is the way you do everything. And if you want to hear more about that, you should go listen to that episode. But this exists like politically, just like it does interpersonally, where like imperialism, colonialism, fascism has inflicted great harm on the world. And there's certain countries that have been victims of these sort of systemic machines for centuries. People have been displaced, attempted, genocided. Some people have been genocided. Like lands have been taken over, cultures have been erased. People live in like constant states of survival mode because they're being bombed every day, because they're being their resources are taken away or rationed or controlled. There's only so many places they can go. Like their movement is restricted, their opportunities are restricted. And when someone revolts or lashes back out, it's then the media at large, like the people with the power, the people with the loudest voice in the room, tend to be like, look at these people, look how they're behaving, like how could we not punish them, how could we not limit them, how could we not like treat them any other way than how we're treating them, like this is how they behave. And it's like, standing up to someone marginalizing you is not the same thing as marginalizing someone. Like they're not equal. It's just like someone abusing someone day in and day out, just wearing away at their self-esteem, wearing away at their autonomy and individuality, gaslighting them, making them question their reality, like getting away with the worst, most heinous mistreatment. And then the person who's taking it one day snaps and like calls the person a name, or talk shit about them and they find out, or like whatever, has a snappy tone one day and the other person gets their feelings hurt. Like usually it's kind of innocuous in the grand scheme of things. Like it's something that's very small, but sometimes these things can get, someone who's hit all the time can hit back. Like these things play out again in very complicated and sometimes extreme ways depending on the situation. But the weight or the gravity of those two actions are not equal. Like reacting to someone abusing you is not the same thing as abuse. And that isn't to say that like, God, like I wish we could live in a world where everyone was peaceful, where there was no war, where like everybody got along and like give peace a chance. Like obviously like I am in the camp that like I wish there was some kind of like world therapy resource where like everyone got therapy and it was all good and everyone had all the resources they needed to take care of themselves, and like our families didn't have to survive generational alcoholism or generational undiagnosed mental illness or generational PTSD from dads who went to war. Like I wish that none of us had to deal with this. I wish that it could be a loving world that's like operates like the leftist spaces I've been in, like organizational spaces where like maybe it takes longer to come to a decision because everyone has to be in alignment, and like we can talk things out and we can do harm reduction and we can like do mutual aid and make sure everyone's taken care of and we don't just like write people off because they're problematic or whatever. That would be lovely, and I think that's a world worth working towards. But that is not the reality right now. And to get there, we have to have a lot of hard conversations. We have to be able to identify when someone is doing harm. We have to notice this Darvo thing happening when it's happening. And we have to be able to tell who's the bad guy in any given situation and then move accordingly, especially within our own lives, but like on the world stage as well, because we're at a point in history, like Pluto is about to go into Aquarius, which means the energy of the world is shifting. It means the way things have been done for some time are going to be undergoing a necessary sort of restructuring and renovation. We're going to see like greed and wealth hoarding for what it is. We're going to see the like hate, fear, and warmongers for what they are. We're going to understand that like, colonial ties to land are fucking bullshit. We're going to see a liberation on like a grand scale, or if not the like culmination of the liberation, then some real steps toward attaining that eventually. And that doesn't look pretty, that doesn't look peaceful. It doesn't look like, You know how looking back on like the civil rights movement, right? Today, like in 2020 when we had all those protests and like uprising for the Black Lives Matter movement, although that had been going on for like many, many years before that. But it's sort of like on the relay race of civil rights for Black people, especially in the United States. Like that was a baton passing moment where like a younger generation sort of realized what was going on and or not maybe not realized it but got a little bit more elevated of a platform. Like with social media we were able to swap stories and like and really learn in a way that the generations before us didn't, because this like access to the internet, I mean, you used to be sort of beholden to like what you learned in school, and public education is like very dependent on the area, like the person who's teaching it. There can be a very problematic spin put on information about the past and history and stuff. I mean, I read the other day that like most people younger than a certain age like don't believe the Holocaust happened or think it was not as bad as it was. Like that is wild. So apparently people still struggle with getting the facts right and like truly understanding the context of history, but it used to be way worse. At least now, like if you want to find, like if you want to truly educate yourself, it's there for free, you know? And especially regarding like tapping into the humanity of like historically marginalized groups and finding out firsthand, you know, reading firsthand experiences, reading how it is for certain people to move through the world, understanding how each of our experiences are different, understanding the overlapping Venn diagrams of privilege and how even within marginalized communities there is sometimes attempts at oppressing other groups because you feel like that makes you safer or whatever. And unpacking all this is like really important, and the information is there, and it's lovely to like figure these things out, although it's like harrowing and depressing and brings up a lot of grief and anxiety, and also just sort of like, why are we like this as people? But it's there, and that's amazing. And we have a lot more awareness than generations before us, and hopefully the ones that come after us will have more than we do because we've done the work, and then we can pass that baton and someone else will carry it into the future. But you know, back then, you know, or I guess from the lens we look at the civil rights movement now, the kind of propagandized version of events is that like the people who were correct in their protests were the ones who were like peaceful and just let people like fucking spit on them or spray them with fire hoses or beat them with batons if they were police, or you know, just people who took it and did not react in even like a, you know, the way that our bodies and our minds and our hearts want to react to someone treating us that way. They're the ones that just like held it together and like sat in and did it peaceful and didn't do it in a way that was like challenging to respectability politics. Respectability politics, if you don't know, is like when people expect you to be like a palatable ally or someone who's like not like a bad representation of like your group or like your identity or whatever. I've gotten this before with like like calling someone racist who's racist, right? Just being like, I see that you're fucking racist. And then I would get a message from someone being like, I really don't think that helps the movement. Like, you catch more flies with honey. Or people being like, you know, you have to dress and look and behave a certain way or else people aren't going to take you seriously. Like, you'll be a better representation if you do X, Y, and Z. And really what that is just like conditional love. Like, that's saying if you behave in a way that challenges me as an ally, then I'm not going to be on your team anymore. And it's like, you should be on the team because it's the right thing to do. You shouldn't be on the team because I'm making it comfortable for you to be on the team. Like, get over yourself. It's not about you. It's about showing up for someone else. And like, if you're an ally who can be alienated, then you're not a very good ally. Like, the cause is the cause, and you should be committed to the cause. And respectability politics, you know, they always, it's like having a conditionally loving parent or partner. Like, there's a line that if you cross, my love will be taken from you. My support will be taken from you. I might run off and go fight for the other side and become like a fascist or a nightmare. You know, I might be one of these people on the internet being like, I used to believe in social justice, but now, and it's like, okay, people annoy you on like on the right side of justice. That doesn't mean you abandon ship. It's just a totally ridiculous way of operating, and it, to me, it always screams that like this person hasn't unpacked enough, and like this person is taking stuff personally that is not personal. But you know, looking back on history, or even the events of like very recent history, or like what's going on in Gaza, like there is no such thing as a perfect victim. Even the stories they tell about people peacefully protesting or whatever, there will always be someone being like, that's my line, that's my respectability politics line, and like I withdraw my support, and that person is being a radical, or like is just stirring up trouble, or is making me uncomfortable, and now I have to like lash out at them or whatever. And I think with the way the energy of the world is going, and it being just sort of like the way we've been doing things for some time is actually no longer sustainable if we keep treating the earth the way we're treating it. If wealth keeps if this wealth disparity keeps growing the way it's going, there's no other option than like that tower falling, you know, that those man-made structures of like how it's always been done have no choice but to crumble, because it's just not sustainable. Like, we can't keep doing this forever, and the more people are suffering, the more likely they are to do something about it. This happens in like abusive relationships all the time, or just like regular life stuff, you know? It's actually not that likely that someone is going to make a change unless they are suffering enough that the situation becomes unbearable. This is true with like jobs, this is true with friendships, this is true with like health stuff sometimes, especially for people who have anxiety around going to the doctor and getting help for things. Like, a lot of times we need to be very, very uncomfortable in order to embrace the discomfort of change. Like, the discomfort and the unknown of the change has to be less bad than continuing with what we're doing. And it's not until you get practiced in the art of changing that you sort of gracefully surrender to the process of change. And in abusive relationships, a lot of times, like, it does have to get to a point where you're like, oh, actually, I can't take this anymore, in order to get off the ride and decide being alone is better than this.